Today, a controversial bill that would increase homeschooling regulations here in the state could make it one step closer to becoming law. You may remember a public hearing went on until after midnight last week. Hundreds of people gathered at the state capitol to speak all about it. Your reporter Anna Stansfield live outside of the state capitol building this morning breaking down what this bill would do. Anna, good morning.
Okay, good morning. Right now, Connecticut is one of 12 states in the country that does not have homeschooling regulations. In more than 12 hours of public testimony here last week, several parents argued it should stay that way, while lawmakers say because of recent tragedies in our state, things need to change. The Waterbury man allegedly held captive by his stepmother for 2 decades. Jacqueline Torres Garcia, the 11-year-old, found dead in a plastic bin. These are the tragedies some lawmakers say could have been avoided with more homeschooling regulations. Both of them were taken out of school and never checked on again. During last week's testimony, many parents argued there are policies in place to avoid situations like that, but this bill aims to add more. School districts would now have to notify DCF if a parent is trying to pull their child out of school, and if there is an open DCF case, they won't be able to. It would also add more formal reporting requirements. Parents would have to register their kid for homeschooling and check back every single year. They would also have to prove their child is actually learning through things like a school portfolio or a state exam. Now, during last week's public testimony, again, that lasted more than 12 hours here, a lot of parents argued that this would infringe on their rights to teach their kids in the ways that they choose. Happening today, the Education Committee will vote on whether or not the bill should move forward in this legislative session. I'm your reporter live in Hartford this morning, Anna Stansfield, Channel 3 Eyewitness News.
Anna, thank you.